desires a relationship with us. He desires us to desire the same with him. And our message today is, I told Freeman, just right up his alley. It's called Taming Tongues and Horses. And I found out in my life that once I say something, it's impossible to unsay it. Once it's out of my mouth, I may want to instantly take it back. But there is no such thing as unringing a bell. And that's because the tongue has a bad habit of saying what the heart has in it. And oftentimes, if I'm honest, my heart is not where it should be. And our scripture in James speaks directly to that. We're studying James 3, 1 through 18. It says, "My brothers and sisters, not many of you should be teachers. I say this because, as you know, we who teach will be judged more strictly than others. We all make many mistakes. A person who never said anything wrong would be perfect. Someone like that would be able to control their whole body. Never say anything. 2. We put bits in the mouths of horses to make them obey us. With these bits, we can control their whole body. It is the same with the ships. A ship is very big and is pushed by strong winds, but a very small rudder controls that big ship. And the one who controls the rudder decides where the ship will go. It goes where it wants to go. And the same with the tongue. It is a very small part of the body, but it can boast about doing great things. A big forest can be started with only a little flame. The tongue is like a fire. It is a world of evil among the parts of our body. It spreads its evil through our whole body and starts a fire that influences all our life. It gets this fire from hell. Humans have control over every kind of wild animal, bird, reptile, fish, and they have controlled all these things, but no one can control the tongue. It is wild and evil, full of deadly poison. We use our tongues to praise our Lord the Father, and then we curse people who were created in God's likeness. These praises and curses come from the same mouth. My brothers and sisters, this should not happen. Do good waters and bad waters flow from the same spring? Of course not. My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree make olives? Or can a grapevine make figs? No, as well as full as salty water cannot give good water. Are there any among you who are really wise and understanding? Then you should show your wisdom by living right. You should do what is good with humility. A wise person does not boast. If you are selfish and have bitter jealousy in your heart, you have no reason to boast. Your boasting is a lie that hides the truth. That kind of wisdom does not come from God. That wisdom comes from the world. It is not spiritual, it is from the devil. Where there is jealousy, selfishness, there will be confusion of every kind of evil. But the wisdom that comes from God is like this. First, it is pure. It is also peaceful, gentle, and easy to please. This wisdom is always ready to help people who are in trouble and do good for others. This wisdom is always fair and honest. People who work for peace in a peaceful way get the blessings that come from right living. I can tell you, as James says, we've trained all sorts of animals in the world. And I've never trained horses. I've been around a few and I've worked with a few. But I did break bulls for a living as a young man, to break them to lead. And what you're essentially doing is taking an animal that hates people and making it desire to follow your will. You're convincing an animal that would rather have nothing to do with you and make it say, yes, what this person wants is what I want. And from what I understand about training horses, it's very much the same attitude. Now, I don't know about you, but that illustration feels just a little bit insulting to me because it puts me in the same category as a wild, dumb animal. But if I'm honest, I do fit that description, unfortunately, far too often. As James says, I have been guilty of praising God and cursing man at the same time. We are a very obstinate people, and we do, in fact, resemble that stubbornness of a man or an animal that is needing training. We have an independent and rebellious spirit that places us in opposition with God. The thing about training an animal, and I believe it's the same with horses, is that it begins with training their attitudes. When you take an animal that has no training and you train it, that animal not only has more value, but it also has a purpose. In fact, that animal will soon forget that it had its own self-will. And I have witnessed cutting horses that were well trained and worth thousands and thousands of dollars each. And those horses literally can herd cattle, or any other animal for that matter, without a rider, because they know the drill. They have become a purposeful animal with a mission that they understand and they do. But furthermore, that horse becomes an extension of the rider. A good horseman and a good horse, you'll see them ride and you'll think they are but one. They seem to act and think as one. And that's because they can be. There is a point where that horse literally understands its rider so well that they will literally read the mind of their rider. And they will be not only magnificent animals, but animals that do work and do purpose. And they find joy in that purpose. Now, the truth of it is, I've never met a horse or a bull who made the decision to say, I think I should train myself to be in submission to someone else. That does not come naturally to an animal, and I would suggest to you it does not come naturally to a human being. When I tell you that we are to be submissive to God's will, there is a part of you who, like the horse fighting the bit, or the bull fighting me putting a ring in its nose, will say, no, I don't think this is what I want. And yet, there is a point where that animal will say, okay, perhaps this is the better way. We must, as human beings, come to that point where we are willing to submit to God. And what James tells me is that my mouth will tell you an awful lot about me. And unfortunately, it does. If you go to put the bit in a horse's mouth that's not trained, and I've watched it happen, and I've even tried it a few times myself, and if that horse doesn't want that bit in its mouth, you're going to fight it. And you will see that horse resisting. With me, oftentimes, I catch myself saying things that I'm going, why did I say that? What was I thinking when that words came out of my mouth? The truth of it is, my mouth will display, not only to myself, but to the entire world, just how unrepentant, uncommitted I am to God. The tongue will display whether or not I am submissive to God or not. And unfortunately, far too often in my life, my mouth has sounded like a wild animal. Ugly and brutal. It is, for a Christian, essential that, as James says, we learn to control our tongue. It will display what is in our heart. It will tell us more about ourselves, and it will tell others more about us. James points out that you cannot both praise and curse out of the same mouth, and yet I do it. And what Paul says in his writings is, there's things I want to do, but I don't do them. And there are things I don't want to do, and I find myself doing them. It is that attitude of when I open my mouth and I go, oh my goodness, where did that come from? It's an indication that there's something in my heart that needs to be dealt with. Like a horse, I need to go back into the training pen. I need to get a little more education. I need to be a little bit more willing to listen to God. And the truth of it is, training is always a process. Anyone who has broken bulls or horses will tell you, you don't walk into the pen and 3 hours later have a trained animal. It's a lifelong process. So too with Christianity. I submitted myself to Christ at age 17. But I'm here to tell you, we had a few years there where I wasn't listening very well. And I will tell you that some of that was just out and out rebellion. Not unlike the bull who resisted the ring or the horse who resisted the bit. I found myself at odds with God and not wanting to hear what he had to say. And like I said, I've not done a lot of training with horses, but I've talked to a few people that have, and they will tell you that there are two major problems that you have to overcome with training a horse. First, you have to have that horse's trust. That horse has to begin to believe that you have its best interest in its mind. If that horse can't trust you, he cannot follow you. He will not follow you. He needs to trust you. In the same way, I need to trust God. I've shared my history that I was very quick to accept Jesus Christ. But because of my family background, accepting God the Father was not something I did easily or willingly. There was this attitude about being a father that just, I had a bad image of that. And in truth, it affected my spiritual walk. I resisted God's training because I didn't trust him well enough. God knows that, and like a patient horse trainer, he took lots of time to train me, to teach me, to learn how I can trust him. If you've ever watched a horse in training, oftentimes they will put them in a big ring with a long rope and a whip, and they will chase that horse around that circle with the whip. And all that horse knows is there's a loud object behind it that scares it. And when that horse finally looks at that person in the center and goes, maybe that person can help me, is when the trainer will stop and the horse will approach. That makes the horse say, I can trust this person. In the same manner, as a Christian, I must learn to trust God. If I can't trust God, I'm certainly not going to put my faith in him. I'm certainly not going to listen to him. The second thing a horseman will tell you is if it's not a fear, sometimes it's a submission. I learned very early on that God was God, and he is omnipotent. He has authority over everything, which means he has every bit of authority and right to dictate to me what I should be and shouldn't be. He can tell me where I go and what I do. He can decide for me. Now, I'm a pretty independent-minded guy, and to take orders from somebody has never been easy for me. And just like that horse, that can be the problem, is if the horse is not willing to submit. If it may say, I trust you, but I'm not submitting to you. I have my own will. I will decide whether what you want is what I want. And too often, I have approached God with that same attitude. Tell me what you want, God, and I'll tell you if I'm willing to do it or not. And I'm here to tell you, friends, that attitude is not what God is seeking. God requests that I submit. As Samuel said as a child when God first called him. Eli told him, when he was called, he says, "Answer, speak, Lord, your servant is listening." I am called to speak to God and say, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." He is submitting and he is willing to do what you call him to do. If you can get a horse that trusts you and will submit to you, my friends, you have a well-trained horse. And that horse will have great value and he will be of great service. And you will have a friend for life. I see the bond between a horse and a human, and it amazes me how those animals will bond with human beings. And there is nothing in the world that makes that horse happier than to see their owner, and vice versa. That is the kind of relationship Jesus Christ wants with us. We must learn to not only trust God, but be willing to submit. But the problem is, it's a learning process, and it goes against our normal bent. Like I said, I never walked into a pen with a bull who says, "You look like the kind of guy that can lead me around." Indeed, I've had bulls put me through walls and butt me through all sorts of different objects because they did not want to listen. And it reminds me a little bit about Mark Twain and what he said once. He says, "Good decisions come from experience. Experience comes from making bad decisions." There is a truth in that, because what has happened in my life is when I would reject God's way, I would find myself having bad experiences. You see, God has a plan for me, a good and a perfect plan, and if I follow it, God will bless me and it will go well. On the other hand, like Mark Twain said, there are times where I've got to just go through the experience of rebelling. The horse will do all it can to fight, submitting. I've had many a bull, and I've got many sore legs and arms from bulls kicking me and knocking me around because they did not want to listen. Now, they eventually submitted because they saw the futility in that. And as I describe that, it shames me to say that in the same manner, I've been the same way with God. For years, I would argue with God. I would fight with God. And I go, "No, God, that's not the way I want to go. That's not the way I want to do it. That's not the path I want to take. No, Lord, I don't like those people. Don't ask me to love them." And yet, that's what God said. And like an ugly, stupid animal that needed training, I had to go through many bad experiences and deal with them in a sense that was to my detriment. I'm here to tell you, while I got kicked and butted a lot, it wasn't any more pleasant for the bull. And for the horse, there are times in the training process where it is terrified because it doesn't know what's going on. But once the training is complete, once the horse is willing to submit, there's a peace and a sense of belonging that horse gains through that training. In the same way with God, if I'm willing to submit, I can trust. Even when life does not make sense, even when life is smacking me in the face, I can go, "My God has got this." I can trust that God has got my hand through all this, and I can trust that He will grow me even further. But like I said before, a horse's training is never quite done. A good horseman will be working with his horse all the time. He will be making him better. He will be training him, and he'll be working on that relationship. It will last the entire length of their relationship together. frequently until one of them dies. That relationship was meant to be permanent. And I'm here to tell you, that is the kind of relationship that Jesus Christ wants with you and me. I am called to be submitting to God. And each and every day, looking to Him and saying, what today, Lord? What do I need to learn today? What have I not picked up yet that I need to learn? You know, when I tell you to get into your Bible, there's a reason for that. This book contains 66 books written into the influence of Jesus Christ Himself. It is what I recall the inerrant Word of God. It is accurate, and it will, in fact, tell you all the answers you need in life. If you want to be trained, it requires you to understand and know what God Himself wants. It also requires me to surrender my self-control. Be willing to accept the bit and say, okay, Lord, where to today? What do you desire today? But you know, the world today would tell you, no, you're your own person. Don't let anyone else control you. Don't let anyone else dictate to you what you should or shouldn't be. And the irony is, the same people who tell you that are subliminally trying to control you and tell you what you should or shouldn't be. James addresses the wisdom of this world, and he says it comes directly from Satan. He says it produces jealousy, selfishness, and confusion, and all kinds of evil. And my friends, I would tell you that the world today is full of that kind of wisdom. It is also full of the idea that you yourself are your own God. You yourself make your own decisions. You yourself control your own destiny. And my friends, nothing could be further from the truth. This world will always reject and rebel against God, because God desires us to be in fellowship with Him. God desires us to seek Him, to let Him guide us. And I'm here to tell you that as crazy as this world gets, it's even more important to be submitting to God, because God is going to take me through the craziness of this world. Like I said, this world is crazy. And I'm here to tell you that I've never seen societies more broken, more divided, more hateful than they are today. If I'm going to survive, if I'm going to thrive in a world like that, I better know what God has to say. And I want to say that James is very clear, and he parallels what the world is doing when and I'll reread this, verse 17 through 18. But the wisdom that comes from God is like this. First, it is pure. It is also peaceful. It is gentle and easy to please. The wisdom is always ready to help people who have trouble and do good for the others. This wisdom is always fair and honest. People who work for peace in a peaceful way get the blessing that comes from the right living. If you listen to that description, there may be people that come to your mind. You say, yeah, that reminds me of such and such. And if that does, I tell you that speaks to their willingness to submit to God. They are like a well-trained horse, listening to what God has prepared for them. But my friends, the world will always be there to tell you not to listen to God. It will always be there to try and distract you from God's direction. Like a plastic bag blowing up under a horse and a rider. the world will always try to separate that bond. It will always try to take you away from God. But God is saying, stay with me, trust me, let me have control. And it amazes me when I see law enforcement horses that are trained to let everything and anything happen around them, and they stay stoically calm. The reason for that is they trust their rider. They trust that they know better than them what noises are scary, which ones are not. And my friends, as I look at that example of a horse that is trained, it causes me to desire that type of relationship with God. I want to be a person who is submitting to God. I want to be in a position where God can use me, where when God speaks, I listen and I say, yes, Lord, whatever you say. When I have that attitude, when I develop it, and as I say when, it's not like I can say I've been there already. I am growing further in that relationship, but I'm not there yet. I have not arrived. And my friends, anyone who tells you they have arrived is probably further back on the road. They do not know. Our relationship with God grows daily, and it is truly a matter of trust and submission. The more I can trust and submit to God, the more opportunity God has to work in me. A Christian should have the same attitude towards God that a horse has to its rider. And friends, that training begins with my tongue. What comes out of my mouth will tell you how well trained or not trained I am. It will either speak of the glories of God or it will embarrass me. And I hate to say it, but I can tell you many times. I just did a funeral on Tuesday up in Eldora for our chief of police. And for many of these people, they haven't seen me in 40 years. And they remembered me as the hard-nosed cop who basically had very little compassion. And so when I looked out on the congregation and I saw people reading the bulletin and looking at my name, looking at me, looking at the name and looking at me like, what? Rick Bachman, a pastor? There was a bit of shock because they remembered a different kind of guy. They remembered a different kind of person who had no pastoral instincts at that point in his life. And rightfully so, my friends. They judged correctly. And I did kind of joke. I said, I probably should have had some paramedics ready because some of you probably weren't ready for that shock. The truth of it is, God has been working in my life since age 17. And now at age 67, He is still working in my life. I am still working at trying to accept the bit and saying, yes, Lord, wherever you say, we will do. Whatever you want, I will go. That is a process that will be developed until I take my last breath. And my friends, the quality of your life between now and that last breath will very much determine how much you've been willing to submit and trust God. And as I said, if you get a horse that is well trained, it's a magnificent thing. But if you've ever been around a horse that doesn't willingly submit or doesn't trust, you see it as a wild animal, out of control. No one wants to be near it. No one wants to have it. What kind of horse do I want to be for God? That's the question I leave with you. Thank you.